Okay, Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. My name is Vineet Kaur, and as Divij said, I've attended two Sidaks as a attendee and one as a TA as well last year. And I think I stumbled upon Sidak through the Sikhi website when I was in university. And I had a lot of questions and I started engaging with a lot of student groups, and that's how I found out about Sikhi. And I remember listening to a lot of webinars in my university days of Sikhi. And the reason I was so attracted to those webinars at that time is because they all seemed so relevant to the questions that I was asking myself. And I don't think I knew at that time that there was an underlying framework that was being applied to answer those questions that seemed so relevant to me. And that's what attracted me to Sidak. And once I got to Sidak, I was able to tap into this network where I came to Sidak with this big question of where do I begin? And I think the answer to that question was directly Gurbani. And I think that initially that was a very overwhelming feeling because I understood and I was aware that I knew very little and I needed to develop a lot of knowledge. And I think over the years of attending Sidak twice and going back to Sidak a couple of times, that network of Sidakers around my computer most of the times, because Sidakers are from all over the place, has allowed me to continue to develop my understanding as well as application of my big question of where do I begin. And my network from Sidak has helped me kind of like navigate this journey. And even here I am today because of the network, and I look forward to expanding that network with all of you.
Hi, Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. My experience with Sidak is that I went when I was 18, so the summer before college, and that started to get me thinking a little bit more about what my personal Sikh journey could look like. But then even in college, I was having difficulty kind of seeing that as something that I wanted to even spend time exploring. And then I was a religious studies major and applied for an internship with Sikhi as a research assistant after I graduated. And so part of my sort of pre-training for that job was to come to Sidak in 2017. And it was like the greatest experience, the greatest summer, because I had been struggling with all these questions about like belonging and like legitimacy in certain spaces and who is allowed in certain spaces and whether or not I felt like I had the sort of like legitimacy to even begin a journey like that. And so going to Sidak, I think, really shook me out of that way of thinking because I met so many Sikhs who had such varying backgrounds. Some had not started a journey at all because they were feeling the same way as me. Some had like a lot of sort of exposure to Sikhi and like had developed some sort of I guess like journey that they were already on. And so having everybody together in that way and finding similarities in our kind of like insecurities and our trepidations, I think like really gave me a lot of confidence to I think embark on the journey I'm on now. So yeah, with that, Vineet, do you actually mind sharing your screen because my Zoom is not letting me without quitting?
Sure. So let's get started with our session on Gurmat framework. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, that my big question was, where do I begin? And one of the first sessions that I developed, attended at Sidak, my first very Sidak, was Gurmat framework. And so the objective of this particular session is today, even today's Hukamnama, we talked about Prab se lag raheo mera chief. How do I attach and remain have my conscious remain attached to the prab. And in order to do that, we have to learn how to integrate that oneness into our life and daily actions. And that is where the big question of what is the Sikh stance, what's the Sikh response to the relevant questions in our life comes from. And so Gurmat framework is that tool that once we understand that, it can help us develop an approach to answer those questions through a Sikh framework for our individual self, but also for the collective Panth as well. And so by exploring the Sikh framework and applying it, we understand these blind spots that exist in our own understanding of certain issues, but it can also help us identify the Panthic blind spots that exist when we are trying to create approaches for current global issues. And it allows us to ask very direct questions to ourselves and our Sangats to then foster this dialogue. And so hopefully today, as we navigate this session, you'll kind of integrate some of the pieces that Jasleen is offering and see how they can help you fit into the frameworks and tools that you use to come up with answers and especially relevant issues around your world. And so the first kind of idea is, why is it that we need Gurmat framework? And I remember I'll take you through this whole journey of, how Gurmat framework made me feel. But before that, I came to Sidak in my first year. I learned about Gurmat framework, and I came in with this mindset that Sikhi was supposed to be this like solely spontaneous and intuitive personal journey. One day I will have this realization, but until then, I learned to surrender and accept. And then I was always in a mental conflict with this idea of like, it has to have logic and it has to be a rational thing and it should be a checklist. And then at some point in my life, I swung the pendulum in the other side and I was like, okay, like obviously the spontaneous thing didn't work out for me. So I need to like, start checking off some boxes and start like rationally and logically working this out. It was only when, I started to consciously process Gurmat framework that I realized that there's a harmony between the two. And it is simultaneously a very intuitive and a personal journey to understand the Gurmat framework, but also it can have very like practical purposes as well. And that will become more relevant when we are bringing the Sikh stance in like Panthic issues, as well as our personal life questions as well. So I remember after my first Sidak and learning about what Gurmat framework was, and this is a personal story of where Gurmat framework led me, is I was walking through my university center, and a pro-life group kind of like focused their eyes on me, and I was not able to disengage. And one of the first questions they asked me, which is I think what kind of like got me even more stuck in that conversation, was, do you have a religion? And I remember answering them, yes, I have a faith. And they're like, what's your faith? And I said, I'm a Sikh. And their third question was, what does Sikhi say about abortion? And I remember like just being like mute. I think having gone on this journey about Gurmat framework, I could have said a lot of things that I had learned through the process of osmosis, being a Punjabi, being an Indo-Canadian, having gone to a liberal university in British Columbia. I had a lot of opinions on that. And I think when somebody directly asked me what was the Sikh response on it, I may have said all of those things because I thought I'm a Sikh and this is my response, so this is a Sikh response. But I think once at that time, I was aware of applying Gurmat framework to my life's questions, and I realized I didn't actually have a very wholesome understanding of what is Gurbani saying, what is our history and our rehet coming together to respond to this issue. And I think that's where Gurmat framework can help us kind of like place brakes on our understanding and take a pause to gather more information and then apply it on our lives as well. So I'll pass it over to Jasleen Kaur to talk a little bit more about the foundations of Gurmat framework.
Okay, thank you, Vineet. So the next few slides, the next 4 slides actually are going to be small videos. And the reason that we have put these in is because when we were talking about okay, what are the foundational things that we need to know when we are using this framework as a tool, there's a good number of things that I think we have to all kind of understand before we can use the framework, just on top of understanding it. And so if you follow Sikri's State of the Month reports, you might remember that our first report was answering this question of who is a Sikh, or I would say exploring the question of who is a Sikh. And the reason for that, and the reason why we've included this small video about that question, is because oftentimes when we are trying to have discussions about Panthic issues, personal issues, global issues, we get into these arguments where sometimes we focus more on that question of legitimacy that I was talking about before, who has legitimacy in this argument? Can I put this checklist up to somebody and say, well, they have more things checked off in terms of who is a Sikh, so their argument is more valid. What I think connects us is what we are centering ourselves around. And so what you'll see, I mean, Hernavruji within the video will also elaborate on this a little bit, but it's not so much the question of who is a Sikh in terms of who's qualified to be called a Sikh, but if you're a Sikh, what are the things that you are centering yourself in? What are your goals, which will be the next video? And also who is having these conversations about different issues, because who have we decided is allowed to be in the room when it comes to certain things. So Vineet, if we can play the Who's a Sikh video first.
Who is a Sikh has now become a political question, and we need to look at it from the angle of a Shabad in Guru Granth Sahib again. The paradigm is very different in Sikhi, in Guru Granth Sahib. It doesn't say you are a Sikh and you are not a Sikh. It says if you call yourself a Sikh, then this is what you do. So the accountability or the onus is left to the individual. So if you follow the Shabad, if you choose Sikhi as a lifestyle and you follow the paradigms of Sikhi, and this is how Guru Granth Sahib approaches it. So who is a Sikh? The one who is in love with the divine, who personally experiences the divine, is becoming a free individual. When they come together, that's considered the Sikh collective or the Panth as well. So being Sikh starts with Shabad and it ends with fighting for free individuals, fighting to create free societies as well.
Thank you, Avinash. We might have to have you share the next few videos as well. So when we're developing this framework, now that we've established what we are all kind of centering ourselves on, the next question is what is the goal of a Sikh? So that's the next video we're going to show you. So when we're developing this framework, what are our larger goals? How can this help us frame our goals? What questions do we want to apply to the Gurmat framework, and what are we trying to get out of it? Are we using the framework because we want to make decisions for other people, or because, the video was talking about, because we want to have this mutual upliftment and this mutual freedom that we're all kind of, we're all freeing ourselves and each other to accept this divine love in and around all of us. So anything that inhibits us from operating in love and achieving that potential is not going to work with this framework. So a lot of times I think we'll find, if you haven't really been using the framework yet, and we'll talk about this even in our personal experiences using it, sometimes it's difficult and it's confusing. And so the question that it's good to come back to, I think, is are the conclusions that we're drawing from the framework are they making us and others more free, or are we further like confining ourselves and others in how we make decisions? And like, are we like honoring that fundamental goal that we're all sharing? So with that, Avinash, if you could play the next video, that'd be great.
Goal of a Sikh, according to Guru Granth Sahib, which is where our ideas come from, is to become free individuals. You might ask, freedom from what? Well, freedom from anything which binds us to develop our full divine potential. So essentially, not listening to religious authorities or political authorities, being free in personal lives, being in collective lives of the communities we live in. So goal in Sikhi is to become free while operating in love. Whatever is not allowing you to become free, fighting that internally as well as externally. So the goal is to become free individuals.
Thank you, Avinash. So then the last two videos are, surprise, Ikonkar and Guru. So if Shabad is helping Sikhs achieve their goals, and we're using this framework to be free using those resources, who is helping us connect with Shabad? So that's where Guru and Ikonkar come in. So I think what we'll do is we'll play the Ikonkar video first. Something that I tell the like teens when we're doing this in the teen course and we're trying to struggle through using the Gurmat framework is, if you're ever confused about whether or not the conclusions that you're coming to using the framework are like, whether or not you're on the right track, it's always good to return to that foundational principle of Ikonkar, because that's what the Guru Granth Sahib begins with. And it's easy, I think, to like get a little confused when you're like working through the framework and dealing with a lot of information that you're like inputting into that framework to get, yeah, it's easy to get confused. So I always say, go back to Ikonkar. And then I think Avinash will play that video, and then I can talk a little bit about Ikonkar and Guru together before we play the Guru video, if that works.
Ik Oankar is the opening of Guru Granth Sahib. This is Guru Nanak's offering to the world about his paradigm, his experience. Ik is one. In Punjabi, ik could mean, if it was spelled out, some or few. But when it's a numeral, it means oneness. It means it's an affirmation. This is not between 0 and 1, like a binaries we call them today. This is about what is, the one reality, one force, oneness idea. So what Guru Nanak Sahib is doing here is, he's explaining his paradigm, that this is what I experience. I don't see the otherness, as we might call it today. There is no who's included and who's not included. This is not about even binaries of what in Indian tradition is called astik or nastik, believer or non-believer, or what we might call today somebody who is, for example, an atheist or a religious personality. This is not that. This is about one is. Ik Oankar. There are Indic ways of looking at it. There are Hindu traditions way to look at it. There are Islamic or Judeo-Christian ways to look at it. This is Guru Nanak's way to look at it. Everyone is. One reality is. So the force is between you and I. Everyone has this force. Do you feel it? You cannot see it, but can you feel it? As Star Wars might call it. If you invoke this force, then you can be a Jedi warrior. Even if you have been a Jedi warrior, you could become a Darth Vader when you invoke it in a negative capacities. So Ik Oankar is Guru Nanak's declaration of his lyrical experience, his religious experience, his love experience, his sovereignty experience, everything. There is no dissection in life. He's experiencing the completeness of what generally we call divinity or divine's personal experience, but this is not divided into sections. This is one. Everything is one. So Ik Oankar is not just there is one God. That would be reducing the idea. Ik Oankar is there is one. which means oneness or one force. Technically, it's called a phonetic signifier, which means this is something which has to be experienced and explained within the context of Guru Granth Sahib. And the Sikhs lovingly call it Ik Oankar. One is, or one reality is, and I like to call that one force.
Thank you, Avinash. So the Sikh worldview begins with Ik Oankar. And I think what you'll see in the Guru video is that you can't have one without the other. And I mean, maybe that seems like kind of an obvious statement, but I think it's, from my own experience using the framework, it's easy sometimes to focus in on one and not the other. And what tends to happen with that is, like, if you're focused in on Ik Oankar, you're all about oneness, and maybe it's all like peace and love, everything's one, but that's a global perspective. That's like a global that's an acknowledgement of sort of all of creation being part of the same thing. But that's not, if you only root your worldview, your Sikh worldview in Ik Oankar, then it's not really a Sikh worldview, because Guru is where Sikhi, that's where like the Sikh worldview begins, because Guru is who's helping you connect with Shabad and helping you understand Ik Oankar. So back to what Vineet was saying earlier about how sometimes we tend to think of Sikhi as either like only kind of this abstract sort of fluid, like spiritual journey that's, you know, kind of peace and love and everything like that. And then sometimes we only think of it as like a set of rules or checklists, or sort of practices that we're doing. It's about putting those two things together. And I think when you only focus on Guru, right, or like only focus on certain elements of the information that you're inputting into the framework through that lens, you can come out with really hard-lined responses and perspectives. And if you come out only looking at Ik Oankar and kind of the abstract sort of like global perspective without focusing in on the Sikh perspective, you can end up being a little bit too kind of wishy-washy and not really like coming up with what is a Sikh statement or a Sikh perspective. So Avinash, if you can play the Guru video, that would be great.
Guru, in its etymological sense, is about someone or something which takes you from darkness to light, from ignorance to enlightenment. In Sikh tradition, it actually is not just that, because anyone can be a teacher, anyone can be even a master, even a prophet. But Sikhs adopted the word Guru, so within Guru Granth Sahib's context, this word actually means perfection. Perfection, who feels the force, Ik Oankar, who feels this force is all pervasive everywhere, her, who has identified with that culture of Naam. And now Guru is the one who provides all this to humanity at large. This is why we say Guru Nanak is the Jagat Guru, or the world Guru, because the Guru experienced all these things. So Guru in Sikh tradition becomes an institutional element, including the physical lives of the Guru, as well as in other forms like in Guru Granth Sahib, who share with humanity, who give to the humanity, who train the people in the culture of Naam. So Guru's role becomes very, very important. It becomes institutionalized. It starts from the idea of the one who himself feels it, the force, the pervasiveness, and the Naam. And then Naam is a catalyst in making this force, this all-pervasiveness and Naam, feel it for those who want to be trained in this culture of Naam. And why this culture of Naam? Because the Guru actually created a new egalitarian society. The Guru created what we call the idea of Kartarpurs, the city where the Creator resides, Begumpura, where the city without sorrow is. So the institution of Guru in Sikhi is somebody who helps you feel the divinity for yourself. But at the same time, if enough people feel it, then they create that reality of city without sorrow within this world. This is why the Guru institution is about being a catalyst, as a trainer, as most importantly, the one who helps you realize the Naam within, the force within, the culture of Har, or all-pervasiveness within.
Thank you, Avinash. Vineet, do you mind sharing your screen again? Thanks. Okay, so this is just a little diagram. We're going to get into what each element means and how they relate to each other. But basically, when Bani, Tavarik, and Ret intersect, that's what we're calling a Gurmat perspective. So it's not just looking at like the philosophical or the theological, the historical or the contemporary understandings by themselves, but it's connecting all of those things together in a way that brings much more nuance to whatever like issue you are thinking about, and sort of complicates it in a healthy way. So Vineet, can we go to the next one? Great, so Barney is the message. So this is Shabad. This comes first in how we build our understanding of Guru's wisdom. So part of forming a Sikh perspective on anything involves actively engaging with Barney, learning about like different thuks, like not just looking at thuks by themselves and not offering any more context to them. So I think that's a thing that we might tend to do because it feels easier, is like we'll just look up a keyword and then come up with a line and maybe use an English translation that's kind of old school and then draw conclusions from that. But when we're looking at Bani and applying the Gurmat framework to an issue using Bani, it's not just about like taking a line out of context and trying to understand that line all by itself. It's a little more involved than that. So an example would be like in this State of the Pansexuality report that we're working on right now, we wanted to look at like all of the different instances where Kam is mentioned to get a fuller picture of like what is Kam in the Guru Granth Sahib. And when you start to do that, things get a little complicated, again, in a healthy way. And I think that's kind of a theme of like using the Gurmat framework, is that there is this healthy tension that nuance might be uncomfortable, but that's also part of the sort of journey of learning and growing with this tool. And I know Vineet and I will both talk about later just like that journey and how it can sometimes be a little bit frustrating. But Vineet, if you want to go to the next slide. Okay, so Tabarik is, I guess you could roughly translate it as like history. And that is how the Gurus exemplified the wisdom. So how they lived out Bani in their lives on earth. So looking at Guru Nanak all the way to Guru Gobind Singh, and then understanding them within their context. Again, so this, I'm going to keep saying this, but there are so many times in like writing State of the Panth reports or discussing certain topics where we might have like examples that we are interpreting a certain way because we're not living in the same context as the Gurus were living in when they were experiencing these things. And so again, painting a fuller picture, offering more of like a well-rounded context is also really important when you're looking at the Warik. And yeah, it's always like good to look at those things as an example, because you might have one interpretation of Bani regarding an issue, and then maybe you go to Tawarik and it's telling you that maybe your interpretation wasn't necessarily correct based on like what you found within Sikh history. And that happens all the time, and you'll kind of see, it's not that you like start with Bani and then just go in order, it's that everything starts with Bani and goes back to Bani, but Tawarik can give you more insight and vice versa. So all these things are kind of in a dialogue together when you're coming up with a Sikh perspective that offers more of like a full picture. Vineet, do you want to go to the next, please? Thank you. Okay, so Ret, the lifestyle. So this is how Bani and Tawarik become relevant to us in our current context. So it's not just looking at like various Ratname and their context, which is also really important, but also how to apply these things to our current lives. So in the abortion report that we put out earlier this year, we didn't just look at the various Ratname that were sort of adjacent or relevant to the topic. We also looked at like, what are the statistics regarding abortion in the top 10 like Sikh diasporic areas and in Punjab. And like, what are the lived realities of Sikhs around the world when it comes to this issue? Because it's not just about sort of taking these things and applying them to our lives with no sort of sense of what our varying contexts are, even within the Panth today. So yeah, I think that's all I want to say about that. Great, thank you, Vineet. So to develop a Gurmat framework, there's a lot of like reading that has to be done. So we're surveying primary sources, that includes the Guru Granth Sahib obviously, and secondary sources. So primary sources are contemporary accounts of an event written by someone who experienced that event or witnessed it. And that can include like original documents and like articles and things like that. The thing that I want to stress again is that with primary sources, especially with various like Rathname, it's really important to look at like where these people were coming from, what were their backgrounds, what context were they writing in. Sometimes the language can seem like a little bit harsh, and again, it's hard to like imagine what people's contexts were throughout history. And so again, like more work has to be done when you're looking at those sources and that information to understand what people are kind of situated in, that and how it's different from our current context. Vineet, thank you. Secondary sources. So secondary sources function to interpret primary sources, help us maybe understand them a bit better, draw conclusions about them. But again, very important to remember that they are one step removed or more from the event or phenomenon. So that's where like the author's background is really, really important. That's where the author's context is important. Whatever biases they might have, we have to take a look at all of that. Okay, so this is just a list of primary and secondary sources. Obviously, Guru Granth Sahib Ji is in the primary sources category. Not too much to say about that. It's just like a little helpful infographic. Vineet, can you go to the next one? Great. So I kind of touched on this already, but evaluating sources is really important. Looking at how the author knew certain things, whether they witnessed the event, where their information is coming from, and what their background and their biases are, because humans are products in some ways of our experiences, and really understanding that.
Yeah, okay, so I think that information, the first time I ever heard that at Sidak Jasleen, I remember feeling like, wow, I wasn't being the systemic in kind of like my approach at figuring out the answers to the questions I had. And I remember going through this journey the first time I consciously saw that Venn diagram, that, okay, like this is great. Now I have a framework that I can use to answer my questions. And soon after, like one of the great things at Sidak is you're immersed, like this is the first session you do, and then you have 2 weeks to use it and apply it. And you're kind of like trialing and, you're conversing with others who've also like now learned about this framework, and you realize that I now know about this framework, but I don't know how to use it. I don't even have the right foundations, sometimes the right knowledge I didn't have to kind of use this framework. And so I start kind of talking to other individuals, my Sangat at Sidak, and even after, to learn a little bit more about Gurbani and Rahat and Tawreek or history. And I start realizing how many misunderstandings I had. And those misunderstandings again stemmed from a lot of like the cultural learning that I had done, and how much I had relied on other people to kind of share that knowledge with me, which then led to having like this overwhelming feeling that I have to start to now address all the misunderstandings I may have. I have to relearn a lot of perspectives that Gurbani is offering me, as well as Sikh history. And then I start to actually use Gurmat framework. And so this could be an overwhelming journey if you are new to this journey, or when you are looking at the lens where you feel that one of these lenses was missing in your life. And to overcome that, Gurmat framework is, again, a tool. It's a tool that you use in the beginning of your journey when you are asking this question of like, where do I begin? Where do I start? And this is a tool that can help you develop a habit and a discipline to bring this understanding of oneness, to invoke this force within you. And as you start to use this framework and tool, and you sit in the discomfort that you have a lot of blind spots in your understanding, and that helps you ask the right questions to your Sangat, to the other mentors that may be around you. And once you start asking the right questions, you start to gain knowledge, you start to engage. And I think it is that engagement process that helps you develop more comfort, more ease, more intuition with this framework and with this tool as well. And so your use of this tool changes from this very disciplined and rigorous approach to collect information and to learn. And it allows you to integrate that information and experience that information a little bit more as you start to develop an intuition through Gurmat framework, with Gurbani, with the Sikh history, and with the Sikh lifestyle as well. And so as we move forward with a little bit a more like nuanced example of how Jasleen was utilizing Gurmat framework in State of the Panth report, I think we invite you to also think about questions that you might have currently or in the past, where you were trying to figure out the Sikh stance, and see how these various elements of the framework would be helpful to shed light on gaps in understanding or blind spots in that area. And also to use this framework with people around you, whether that is right now in the question and answer chat group, where you could say, I don't know, I want to know a little bit more about that, or in your more physical sangats around where you are. And so I think tapping into your sangats as you are sitting in that discomfort of Gurmat framework is a great way to kind of start this journey and tap into it. And they are the ones who are going to create that space around you to provide you the resources and that knowledge, and also those questions that will kind of pull you forward in your journey to develop an intuitive ease with this tool and framework as well. Jasleen, I'm looking forward to your example and how you bring Gurmat framework into.
Thanks. Yeah, I think Vineet said it really well. It's the thing about the Gurmat framework is that I think both of us have spent a few years now just like knowing what it is, sort of struggling with it. And it becomes, we were talking about it, I think a couple of days ago, as this kind of like dynamic and like living sort of thing that you're like walking with. And it becomes more intuitive over time, but I don't think that either of us would say that we have like a full handle on it. It is really overwhelming, and it does require a lot of work and a commitment to learning, and to being patient with yourself and with others. And I think the example that I'm going to go over in the next slide, Vineet, if you want to go to that, is about the abortion report. So maybe some of you have read it, maybe not. But I wanted to just take you through sort of like what we were thinking of as a team when we were beginning to approach this topic, and I really want to let you in on how much of a struggle it was for me to work on it at first. Because I think it's important for us to be a little bit honest about like the growing pains that come with with this kind of stuff. So when we were first thinking about writing about abortion, we basically sat down as a team and we were like, okay, what are the common questions that people have when it comes to this issue, and what, like, how can we sort of categorize them within the framework? And the questions that are often asked by people are like, when does life begin? What does your religion say about when does life begin? And then where's the place of, or is there a place for value judgment within that? And then we have the question of like, who has the right to make decisions about abortion, and what does Sikh history tell us about abortion, which the question underneath it became more of the question that was relevant, because there isn't anything in Sikh history that specifically talks about abortion in the way that we might understand it in like Western diasporas that are removed from what's like commonly called like female infanticide or like sex selective abortion. So we wanted to make a distinction between those things. Like, yes, this is adjacent in some way, but it's also not really what we set out to write the report about. But to not acknowledge it is to not look at the entire picture of that, of like Reth, right? Like, what is the global Panth going through? Because it's not like this is a practice that's like a part of, it's like stuck in history. This is still happening. So we ended up, the report started to like morph a little bit. So we talked about abortion, we talked about these questions, but we also explored the lived realities of Punjabi people who can become pregnant, and what they might be facing outside of just kind of the binary arguments that exist oftentimes in like public discourse in like America and Canada and the UK, which is like, are you pro-choice or are you pro-life? So that very quickly becomes complicated, because the question of choice becomes complicated. There are so many things that we had to think about in terms of like internal pressures, external pressures, questions of like, is it honor, like family dynamics, family reputation, this idea of shame. So it became very quickly a very overwhelming thing to work through. And I think something that, you know, we've talked about earlier in this presentation is about the like value of Sangat and having these conversations in a way that feels like safe, where you can explore and struggle through certain things together. And so when I first started to write this report, I think it was like September, and I was having such a hard time of extricating myself and my own biases from the report. And it made me feel, I was very like paralyzed for a long time, because I felt like I couldn't write the report because I had sort of these righteous, self-righteous maybe ideas about like what needed to be in the report. And my team members very gently informed me that it's not about me. This is like a Panthic, this is a global issue, right? And so that journey of understanding that nuance is important, even when you feel like you're right, or you're worried about letting down like an entire, like 50 or more % of the Panth who are able to become pregnant, is difficult. And I think it took me a couple months of like stepping back from the report and just having those conversations where it felt a little less like set in stone. So struggling through things with people on the phone, people who had very different experiences than me, who grew up in very different like diasporic Sikh contexts than I did. And it opened my eyes to a lot of like larger issues outside of abortion that play a role in how we think of this particular thing. So are we as a community supporting each other in these instances? And like, are we only thinking about abortion in kind of the best case scenario where it's like two people who are in a mutually loving relationship and are like married, get pregnant, and then there's a question of whether or not they want to stay pregnant, right? But what about issues of like rape? What about issues of people not being in what is like deemed by our community as like an acceptable relationship? What if there's abuse? Like there's all these questions that I wasn't thinking of, and having those conversations made that report a lot more well-rounded, because I wasn't just thinking from my like narrow lens of like being a Sikh in the Western context. So yeah, so I just wanted to show you guys a little bit about like what we the questions we're thinking of and how that becomes much more complicated as we continue to write. And yeah, Vineet, if you could go to the next one. So, okay, so the major takeaways. The report is online. If you want to download it, it's free. So I just wanted to go through the major takeaways. So we looked at that question of like, where does life begin? And it's very clear that a Gurmat perspective tells us that an act of consensual conception is a divine thing. But we also know, and this is the question of like, am I looking at Bani as a whole, or am I just looking at certain books and not contextualizing them? The question of value judgments is important there. So if this is a thing that we know, we also have to look at like, where is the place of value judgment, and is there one? And I think it becomes very clear very quickly that there isn't a place for value judgment. And then we looked at tawarik, like I was saying before. We looked more at female infanticide, or now sex-selective abortion. And we did make a distinction, but it's also important to acknowledge that like certain people who are going through this decision and struggling with this don't have such clear like categories and such clear ideas of like choice, and I think like it's easy to forget that when you're in when you're blind to certain things because of your context. And again, Red gives us insight into the lived experiences of people all around the globe who are part of our global Panth, and what they might be struggling with within their context. So something that I think was a common response to the report was that like some people were saying they wished it was more hardlined and progressive, and some people said they wished it was more hardlined and like conservative. And so getting those responses, I think, is a positive thing, because it tells me that as a team, we've done the work to like sit in the nuance of this issue. Because our goal with the State of the Panth reports, and what hopefully your goal will be with the Gurmat framework, is not to say this is the end all be all answer and that's it. What we find very quickly is that we are all coming with like vastly different experiences, backgrounds, opinions, biases, and within the context of somebody making that decision, they're in very unique contexts as well. So it's like there's an infinitude of possibilities that somebody could be situated in when it comes to this. And it's not, I think, it's not valuable to kind of like set up a few sort of scenarios and say like, this is it, because we know that that's not true. So we ended up making recommendations. Every report ends with individual recommendations and institutional recommendations. And you'll find when you're using the framework that that's how you can kind of think of it. You might be thinking of individual issues, what you think about something, and then when maybe you become more confident or you want to have discussions with your Sangit about stuff, then you're sort of pivoting to like, how do I also look at the institutional recommendations? So we found that the thing that we could all kind of agree on, whether we disagreed or not about like the issue of abortion and, you know, whether or not certain people should be making certain decisions, because that's not our goal with these reports, is that like those who are considering abortion ought to seek support in whatever way they're comfortable with. And we very much acknowledged that like, that's not always in the Gurdwara, that's not always in the Sikh community. And so again, nuance has to be added in there. And institutions can look to Gurmat for guidance on how to be non-judgmental and provide those spaces of support and understanding, and understand the larger like issues within the community and outside of it that might lead someone to make certain decisions. So something we found in the surveys, sorry, I didn't mention this, but we survey the Panth and, you know, try to get kind of a sense of where people's heads are at. Something that was said a lot was like, if somebody's making this decision, we can just give them a lot of money and set them up in a house and like, it'll be great. And I think that really led us to sort of self-reflexively interrogate whether or not we're like in a position as a community to offer that kind of support. And I think like, to be honest, we're not. And so really exploring like, what are the things that we're not providing for our most vulnerable? What are the things that the support systems that we're not giving to people? And how do we tackle those things instead of like sort of sitting back and saying, you're not allowed to do this and you have to do this? Because I think you'll find that like, as you work with this framework, that nuance that might've been uncomfortable earlier becomes like a way that you can, one, engage in dialogue more comfortably, and also like offer empathy even in moments when you might be like, but I don't really think that, like, but I have this perspective. So yeah, Vineet, if you want to go to the next slide. Okay, so we wanted to talk a little bit about how we foster fruitful community dialogue around Panthic issues, especially at a time where like we're all online and we're all having kind of conversations in our small spheres and in our like echo chambers. So Vineet, do you want to maybe start with this?
Sure. I think just in the previous slide, you had mentioned that this, Gurmat framework, as we are learning to apply it and we sit in the discomfort and the nuance of the three foundational principles guiding us rather than our own value judgments of what we believe in. Just that very action and experience of it is, I think, what is going to foster the fruitful conversation. I think dismantling this paradigm that I'm coming from a progressive angle and somebody else is coming from a conservative angle, and opening the discussion with, what is the Sikh paradigm, and can we use that to build our discussion and dialogue in? So one of the ways that you can look at Gurmat framework is a tool, not the tool. And so initially, because this is a framework that is developed not by you personally, there's going to be a lot of discomfort, and you'll have to break into it, and you'll have to use it multiple times and kind of overcome the discomfort of using something that is not always intuitive, and you do have to learn and accumulate some kind of practice with it. But I think over time, it will become your way of engaging in discourse on Sikh issues as well as global perspectives. And another thing that I invite you to do is use it both in turn for yourself, for the questions you have, as well as the questions that your Sangat might have, because that's where you actually get to exercise this nuanced way of being open to accepting what Gurbani and Rehat and Tawreek has to say, rather than what your previous values want you to say. And I know that there is a question in the chat kind of addressing or asking the same question. That's my take on the first question. Do you want to add anything to that, Jasleen?
Yeah, I think like nobody's asking, I know that this is like an overwhelming session, so nobody's asking everybody here to like jump in tomorrow and try to engage in dialogue. I think you have to do a lot of the like individual work and kind of let the framework and Barney like chisel you so that you can eventually engage in those discussions. Because it is difficult, like I'm not gonna lie, like it's difficult. And the difference I think that I experienced with like the abortion reports specifically that I found myself changing over time was that like instead of it becoming a thing that paralyzed me, it became a thing that I was like eager to talk about with other people who didn't necessarily agree with me, and have those conversations despite how maybe uncomfortable they can be. And I did. I had discussions with people who did not agree with me. One of our reviewers is a fairly like, I don't know, I don't like to use like conservative progressive, but he has different views in terms of like a lot of things that we write about. And so we had a respectful dialogue about his feedback. And sometimes I think when we talk about like Sangat in general, a lot of times we think of like our chosen Sangat and like, I'm going to surround myself with people who agree with me. And, you know, Vineet and I have talked about this, like Sangat as a whole, maybe not your necessarily chosen Sangat, but people who push you to think differently or who disagree with you in ways that maybe are like frustrating or uncomfortable, they're still opening you up to the vastness of Ikonkar. So what we talk about with people where like we're butting heads in some way and we're disagreeing, as long as we're not like dismissing each other and calling each other names or putting each other in like certain categories and labels, I think that that still does something for us, because it encourages us to pull back in some way and like really sit in the nuance of our disagreements about certain issues. And that doesn't mean that it's always like fun or like or that you always like appreciate it in the moment. And yeah, and I think that's where the second question comes in of like, what do we do about like opinions or perspectives that are actively harmful? Because there are people who have opinions that sort of dismiss the like human dignity or the rights of certain people, and like what is our responsibility in engaging with that, or like is it our responsibility to engage in that? And I think for me, I would say that like, again, nobody's asking you to jump in and do things that are like emotionally or intellectually exhausting or taxing in any way. But if you feel like you have the tools and kind of the like emotional bandwidth to do that, I encourage it. And that can't always happen on the internet or on Twitter. But you know, I've seen people like have their minds actively changed. And I've seen people like become more nuanced in their understandings. But it takes like this kind of stubborn like love that is difficult sometimes to remind yourself of, but we all want better for each other, right? If we're going to talk about this collective freeing and freedom, that's our goal. We all love each other, we expect better of each other, and that's part of like being a part of this like global bund. And that means engaging sometimes when it's like not always fun, but again, it's not always your responsibility if that's like a difficult thing. Yeah, Vineet, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's you know, you're going to have a lot of different experiences, and every time you meet Gurmat framework, you're going to be a different person, and therefore your engagement with the tool or framework would be different, because the idea is that you're using the tool to change your perspective or your understanding on something. And if you do, if you find yourself in a space where you feel like the opinions are really harmful and they're not really staying on course, you can always invoke that, you know, force in you. There's always this intuitive sense of like the vastness as well. And if you feel like that dialogue is not fostering the oneness, then you can choose to say that this discussion needs to happen at a later time as well. Or you need to go back and learn more, and they need to go back and learn more, because you both reached a dead end of how to now cross communicate in those situations. But even that experience in itself allows you to figure out newer questions. And it's really important for us to build that collective. We want to engage in answering these questions for ourselves as well as for others around us, because when we look for answers for a community or a larger community, that we tap into recognizing the vulnerability of others and shackles that, you know, are placed on certain individuals or certain communities. And it is our Panthic work to also work on those. And therefore, we need to engage in conversations with individuals from all walks of life as well as opinion. But, you know, as we close this session, we send you off on this journey. And as you embark on this journey, you are welcome to engage and ask questions on our Twitter at Sikhi, on our website. There's lots of articles, webinars that also address a lot of questions. And so I think at this point, we do invite some questions that you might have right away. And then we look forward to this ongoing conversation. So Anu, if you have questions, we are happy to take them.
No, thanks Vineet and Jasleen for leading us on that session. We did have one question in the chat that I wanted to bring up. We are a little short on time, so I'll just keep it to one question and we can go from there. The question here is, could you talk a bit more about situations in which the Gurmat framework points towards an answer that is different from your pre-existing values? And then there's a second follow-up to that, and it says, does that mean the pre-existing values were wrong? So I guess your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I will take it back to the abortion report. I, grew up not really feeling like I needed to have a Sikh perspective on abortion. I was like, I'm pro-choice and that's it. And that's why the report was really hard for me to start working on in the beginning. Because that like binary of pro-choice and pro-life is also complicated, which I think I mentioned before. But, Gurbani says that like the consensual conception is divine. And the sort of like scientific part of my like upbringing, I guess, was like, I don't know how to like wrap my head around that. And I really did struggle with that because I thought that meant that like, okay, so Sikhi is like pro-life and that's it. And I think like the way that I would encourage you to start thinking about things with the Sikh perspective is that nothing is ever as simple as like a one-liner statement about like what is and what isn't. And so that's like been a big part of my learning and growing with the framework and with like working on these reports. And I don't know if that means that the pre-existing values were wrong. I think maybe it just means that they weren't rooted in a Sikh perspective. And, you're not always going to think about everything in the context of the Sikh perspective because we're not like trained to think that way. And that's kind of part of what this is hopefully like the beginning of starting to use the framework until it becomes more intuitive. So yeah, that stuff happens definitely. And it's hard. Like the unlearning in those situations is painful for sure. But yeah, thanks for the question.